Some people think they know what quiet looks like. They see someone who keeps to themselves, speaks softly, and avoids confrontation, and they mistake silence for weakness. They see someone who doesn't fight back and assume they can't. But here's what they don't understand about truly dangerous people. The most lethal ones often appear the most harmless. They've learned that real power doesn't need to announce itself, and the deadliest skills are the ones nobody sees coming. Today's story is about what happens when playground bullies make the catastrophic mistake of thinking they can bury someone who spent years crawling through death traps underground. Someone who survived hell that most people can't even imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves across Jefferson Elementary's playground as 8-year-old Tommy Chen sat alone on the weathered wooden bench, watching other children chase each other across the blacktop. His small frame was hunched over a worn paperback novel, thick glasses perched on his nose, completely absorbed in a world far from the chaos of recess. To anyone observing, Tommy appeared to be just another bookish kid who preferred stories to socializing, but appearances can be devastatingly deceiving. Tommy had transferred to Jefferson Elementary 3 months ago when his family moved to the small Nebraska town of Millfield. His parents had told the school administrators that they were relocating for his father's new job at the grain processing plant, which was technically true. What they hadn't mentioned was that 38-year-old Tommy Chen wasn't actually 8 years old. Due to a rare genetic condition that had stunted his growth and kept his features youthful, Tommy was trapped in the body of a child while possessing the mind and experiences of a grown man. More specifically, the mind of a decorated Vietnam War tunnel rat who had spent 2 years crawling through the underground networks of Siuchi, facing down enemy combatants in spaces so narrow that most people would panic just thinking about them. The condition had been both a curse and an unexpected gift during the war. When the army needed soldiers small enough to navigate the intricate tunnel systems that the Viet Cong had carved beneath the Vietnamese countryside, Tommy's diminutive stature made him invaluable. While other soldiers fought above ground, he had become a ghost in the darkness below, armed with nothing but a pistol, a flashlight, and nerves that most people couldn't comprehend. He had learned to move through absolute blackness to control his breathing in suffocating spaces and to make life or death decisions in milliseconds while underground and alone. The war had ended 15 years ago, but the nightmares hadn't. Tommy had tried to build a normal life, worked various jobs, even attempted college, but his appearance made everything complicated. People either treated him like a child or stared at him like a circus curiosity. His parents, now elderly and needing care, had suggested this radical solution: enroll him in elementary school in a small town where nobody knew their history. Let him experience the childhood he'd never had while living quietly and avoiding attention. It seemed like a perfect plan until the bullies found him. Bradley Morrison was everything Tommy wasn't. Tall for his age, athletic, and blessed with the kind of natural confidence that made teachers smile and parents nod approvingly. His sandy brown hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes were expensive, and his easy smile masked a cruel streak that had been developing since kindergarten. Bradley had quickly established himself as the unofficial king of the 4th grade, surrounding himself with followers who were eager to bask in his popularity and avoid becoming his targets. Standing beside Bradley were his 2 constant companions: Derek Sullivan, a stocky boy with red hair and freckles who compensated for his insecurities by being even meaner than his leader, and Kevin Martinez, whose parents' money had bought him designer sneakers and a place in Bradley's inner circle, despite his obvious nervousness about their activities. The 3 of them had noticed Tommy on his 2nd day at Jefferson Elementary and had immediately identified him as an ideal target. It had started with small things: accidentally knocking his books off his desk during class, making loud comments about his height when teachers weren't listening, calling him names like baby and meat that cut deeper than they could possibly understand. But Tommy endured it all with the same silent patience that had kept him alive in the tunnels of Vietnam. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best strategy was to become invisible, to let your enemies underestimate you while you gathered information and waited for the right moment. The problem was that his lack of reaction only seemed to encourage them. Week after week, their harassment had escalated. They had started following him during recess, cornering him in empty hallways, and making his daily existence a constant exercise in humiliation. Other students either joined in the laughter or looked the other way, following the brutal social hierarchy that governed elementary school politics just as viciously as any adult workplace. What Bradley and his friends didn't know, what nobody at Jefferson Elementary could possibly guess, was that their quiet target had survived situations that would have broken most grown men. While they were learning multiplication tables, Tommy had been learning to identify booby traps in absolute darkness. While they were worried about pop quizzes, he had been making split-second decisions that meant the difference between coming home alive or not coming home at all. Every day they pushed him was another day he added to his mental catalog of their weaknesses, their patterns, their tells. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late October. The playground was busy with children enjoying the last warm day before winter set in, and Tommy had found his usual spot on the bench with his book. He was reading about adventure and heroism, ironically enough, when he heard the familiar voices approaching from behind. Bradley's laugh carried across the playground, followed by Derek's snickering and Kevin's nervous giggle. Tommy didn't look up from his book, but every muscle in his body tensed with the awareness that had kept him alive underground. The playground supervisor was distracted, helping a crying first grader who had scraped her knee on the monkey bars. The other children were spread across the large playground, too far away to intervene, even if they had been inclined to help. Tommy was alone with his tormentors, just the way they preferred it, but this time they had chosen their moment poorly. This time, they were about to discover that some quiet people stay quiet for very good reasons. Well, Bradley's voice carried that familiar tone of mock friendliness that Tommy had learned to recognize as a warning sign. Look what we have here. Little Tommy all by himself again with his precious little book. Tommy kept his eyes focused on the page, though he wasn't actually reading anymore. His peripheral vision tracked the movement of the three boys as they arranged themselves around his bench in a loose semicircle, cutting off his potential escape routes. It was a formation he recognized from his military training, though these children had no idea they were unconsciously employing basic tactical positioning. Bradley positioned himself directly in front, while Derek moved to Tommy's left and Kevin flanked right. Amateur hour compared to what Tommy had faced in the tunnels, but effective enough against most 8-year-olds. What's that you're reading, baby boy? Derek reached over and snatched the book from Tommy's hands before he could react. The sudden movement made Tommy's combat instincts flare for just a moment. Muscle memory from years of having to respond instantly to threats in confined spaces, but he forced himself to remain still, to project the same helpless demeanor that had kept him safe for months. Derek held the book up mockingly, squinting at the cover. Adventure stories, really? I bet you dream about being brave and strong instead of the tiny little nothing you actually are. He tossed the book carelessly behind him, pages fluttering. As it hit the ground near the sandbox, Tommy watched his book land in the sand and felt something cold settle in his chest. That book had been a gift from his unit commander after his first successful tunnel mission, a small acknowledgement of courage that had meant more to him than any official medal. It was one of the few possessions he had kept from his previous life, a tangible reminder that he had once been someone who mattered, someone who made a difference. Seeing it dismissed and discarded like trash-triggered memories he had been trying to keep buried. "Ah, look," Kevin said, noticing Tommy's expression. "I think we hurt his feelings. Poor little baby is going to cry." His voice carried that particular edge that came from someone trying too hard to impress his friends, compensating for his own insecurities by being needlessly cruel. Bradley stepped closer, his shadow falling across Tommy's small form. "You know what your problem is, Tommy? You think you're special because you read all those big words and act all quiet and mysterious. But the truth is, you're just a freak. A weird little kid who doesn't belong anywhere." The words stung because they contained enough truth to hurt. Tommy had spent his entire adult life feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. Too young looking for adult society, too old mentally for actual children, too damaged by war for civilian life. But what Bradley couldn't understand was that not belonging had also made Tommy incredibly dangerous. When you had nothing left to lose, when you had already survived the worst that humans could do to each other, playground politics became almost laughably insignificant. "I heard something interesting about you," Bradley continued, clearly enjoying having a captive audience. "My mom works at the school office, and she was talking to my dad about how weird it is that there's no record of you attending any other schools, like you just appeared out of nowhere 3 months ago. What's your story, freak? Are you some kind of runaway? Are you hiding something?" Tommy's blood ran cold. If Bradley's mother was asking questions in the school office, if she was starting to dig into his background, it could unravel everything. His parents had worked carefully with a lawyer to create a plausible paper trail, but it wouldn't stand up to serious scrutiny. The last thing he needed was a curious parent deciding to investigate further. Derek had been growing impatient with the verbal harassment and decided to escalate things physically. He reached over and shoved Tommy hard in the shoulder, nearly knocking him off the bench. "Answer when Bradley talks to you, you little weirdo. Where did you come from? What are you hiding?" The shove triggered a flood of muscle memory that Tommy had to fight to suppress. In the tunnels, when someone grabbed you from behind or pushed you unexpectedly, the correct response was immediate and lethal. You turned, you struck, you eliminated the threat before it could eliminate you. The reflexes were still there, hardwired into his nervous system after years of life-or-death situations. But 8-year-old Tommy Chen couldn't display those kinds of reflexes without raising questions he couldn't answer. Instead, he forced himself to appear shaken and intimidated, which wasn't entirely an act. The physical contact had stirred up memories he preferred to keep locked away. Memories of crawling through pitch-black tunnels barely wide enough for his body, of sudden ambushes in underground chambers, of fighting for his life in spaces so cramped that traditional combat techniques were useless. Those memories carried with them the phantom sensation of packed earth pressing in from all sides, the suffocating weight of being buried alive. "Please just leave me alone," Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying just the right note of defeated resignation. "I haven't done anything to you." "That's your problem right there," Bradley said, his confidence growing with every sign of Tommy's apparent weakness. "You haven't done anything. You just sit there like a bump on a log, taking up space that normal kids could be using." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This school would be better off without you. Kevin, emboldened by his friend's escalating aggression, decided to contribute his own insight. "I bet he's not even really 8 years old. I bet he's like one of those weird kids who got held back a bunch of times because he's too stupid to learn anything. That's why he looks so young but acts so weird." The irony of Kevin's guess being both completely wrong and uncomfortably close to the truth wasn't lost on Tommy. If these children knew that they were tormenting a combat veteran who had earned 3 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for valor, their attitudes might change dramatically. But that knowledge would also destroy the fragile new life he was trying to build. Derek had wandered over to retrieve Tommy's book from where it had landed near the sandbox. But instead of returning it, he had a different idea. You know what? Guys, I think Tommy here needs to learn what happens to freaks who don't know their place. Look at all this nice sand over here. Perfect for teaching lessons. Tommy's blood pressure spiked as he realized what Derek was suggesting. The sandbox was large and deep, filled with coarse sand that the school maintenance crew had recently refreshed for the younger children. In the hands of malicious children, that innocent play area could become something far more sinister. Something that would trigger every nightmare Tommy had fought to suppress about being trapped underground. Bradley's eyes lit up with cruel inspiration. Oh, that's perfect. Absolutely perfect. Tommy likes to bury his nose in books all the time. Maybe we should help him understand what being buried really feels like. The three boys began moving toward the sandbox with a purposefulness that made Tommy's combat instincts scream warnings. This was no longer simple harassment or even ordinary bullying. They were planning something that could cause real psychological damage, something that could trigger the kind of panic response that had ended Tommy's military career and haunted his civilian life. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that they were about to assault someone who had spent 2 years of his life in conditions that would drive most people insane. Someone who had learned to fight and kill in spaces more confined than any sandbox. Someone who had survived being actually buried alive under enemy fire and had clawed his way out through sheer determination and training. Tommy rose slowly from the bench, his movement carefully controlled to appear reluctant rather than threatening. Inside his small chest, his heart was pounding with a combination of genuine anxiety and carefully suppressed rage. These children had no idea what they were awakening, no understanding of the sleeping dragon they were about to provoke. They saw a helpless victim who would submit to whatever humiliation they had planned. They were about to learn the difference between someone who appeared harmless and someone who was truly dangerous. "Come on, Tommy," Bradley said with false sweetness, gesturing toward the sandbox like he was offering a wonderful opportunity. "We just want to show you something cool. Don't you want to see what it feels like to be part of the playground instead of just sitting on the sidelines all the time?" Tommy's trained eye quickly assessed the tactical situation. The sandbox was positioned in a corner of the playground, partially hidden from the main areas by a cluster of oak trees whose fallen leaves created natural cover. The playground supervisor was still occupied with the injured first grader, and the nearest group of children was at least 50 yards away, too far to hear anything over the ambient noise of recess. His tormentors had chosen their moment well, whether by luck or instinct. As they approached the sandbox, Tommy noticed details that the children couldn't possibly appreciate. The sand was loosely packed, recently delivered, and not yet compressed by weeks of play. The wooden borders stood about 18 inches high, creating a contained space roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. The depth appeared to be at least 2 feet, more than enough to bury someone of his small stature. What the bullies saw as a perfect tool for humiliation, Tommy recognized as a potentially lethal trap. Derek reached the sandbox first and kicked experimentally at the sand, sending up small clouds of dust. "Oh yeah, this is going to be perfect. Look how deep this stuff is. We could bury a whole person in here and nobody would even see them." Kevin laughed nervously, though there was something in his expression that suggested he was beginning to have second thoughts about their plan. "Are you sure we should do this? I mean, what if someone sees us? What if Tommy tells on us?" Bradley shot Kevin a withering look that immediately silenced his concerns. "Tommy's not going to tell anyone anything, are you, Tommy? Because if you do, we'll just tell everyone that you're a liar and a crybaby. Who do you think they're going to believe? The 3 most popular kids in 4th grade, or the weird little freak who doesn't even belong here?" The threat carried more weight than Bradley could possibly understand. If Tommy reported this incident, it would inevitably lead to questions about his background, his family situation, his medical records. Bradley was now scooping it with both hands, clearly enjoying the power he wielded over his helpless victim. Derek had found a small plastic shovel abandoned by younger children and was using it to add sand more efficiently. Kevin maintained his grip on Tommy's arms while nervously glancing around to make sure they weren't being observed. "Please stop," Tommy gasped, and the desperation in his voice was entirely genuine. Not because he feared physical harm from a few inches of playground sand, but because the psychological assault was triggering responses that could lead to actions he might not be able to control. "Stop?" Bradley repeated mockingly. "We're just getting started. By the time we're done with you, you'll understand exactly where you belong in this school's pecking order." The sand had reached Tommy's collarbone now, its weight making breathing genuinely difficult. In his mind, he wasn't on a Nebraska playground anymore. He was back in Southeast Asia, trapped in a tunnel that was collapsing around him, fighting for every breath while enemy soldiers searched overhead for any sign of life to eliminate. The rational part of his mind knew the difference, but his nervous system was responding to the perceived threat with increasing urgency. That was when Tommy realized that these children had just crossed a line they didn't even know existed. They had moved beyond harassment into territory that his training and experience classified as a genuine survival situation. They had triggered responses that were designed to keep him alive in combat, responses that didn't distinguish between enemy soldiers and playground bullies. The quiet, helpless victim they thought they were tormenting was about to disappear, forever, replaced by something far more dangerous than their worst nightmares could imagine. The sand had reached Tommy's throat when something fundamental shifted inside his mind. It wasn't a conscious decision or a moment of choosing to fight back. Instead, it was the automatic activation of survival protocols that had been burned into his neural pathways during the darkest months of his military service. His breathing pattern changed first, shifting from panicked gasps to the controlled, rhythmic intake that tunnel rats used to maximize oxygen efficiency in confined spaces. His heart rate, which had been spiking with anxiety, suddenly dropped to the steady, measured pace of someone preparing for combat. The transformation was invisible to his tormentors, who were too focused on their cruel entertainment to notice the subtle changes in their victim's physiology. Bradley continued scooping sand with gleeful enthusiasm, while Derek worked methodically with his plastic shovel to build up the burial mound. Kevin maintained his grip on Tommy's arms, though he was beginning to look uncomfortable with how far their prank had escalated. Tommy's mind began processing the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. 3 hostiles in close proximity, all focused on a single objective. Confined operating environment with limited mobility options. No immediate backup or extraction possibilities. Rules of engagement unclear due to non-combatant status of opponents. The analytical framework that had kept him alive in Vietnamese tunnel networks was now cataloging threats and opportunities on a Nebraska playground. What his attackers didn't understand was that tunnel warfare had taught Tommy to function effectively in conditions that would incapacitate most people. Being buried wasn't just a fear to overcome. It was a working environment he had operated in for years. The weight of earth pressing down on his body, the restriction of movement, the challenge of breathing in confined spaces, these were all familiar problems with known solutions. The sand continued to accumulate around his neck and shoulders. But Tommy's perception of the threat had fundamentally changed. Instead of fighting panic, he was now calculating angles of attack and probability matrices for successful engagement. His body remained still not from helplessness, but from the predatory patience of someone waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Bradley had grown more aggressive in his burial efforts, using both hands to pile sand higher around Tommy's head. "Look at him now," he taunted. "Not so quiet and mysterious anymore, are you? Just a scared little baby who can't do anything to stop us." The words were intended to inflict psychological damage, but they barely registered in Tommy's consciousness. He was operating in a different mental space now, one where emotional manipulation held no power and only tactical considerations mattered. Derek had abandoned his plastic shovel in favor of using his hands to pack the sand more tightly around their victim's body. "We should take a picture of this," he suggested excitedly. "Something to remember how pathetic he looks when he's not pretending to be all smart and special." The suggestion made Kevin visibly nervous, perhaps recognizing that photographic evidence of their activities could lead to consequences they hadn't fully considered. Tommy's eyes remained open and alert, tracking the positions and movements of all three boys with the mechanical precision of a targeting system. His arms were still pinned by Kevin's weight, but he could feel the exact points of contact and pressure. His legs were restricted by Derek's position, but tunnel rat training had taught him dozens of techniques for fighting effectively from compromised positions. Most importantly, none of his attackers showed any awareness that their victim's apparent helplessness might be an illusion. The sand had now covered most of Tommy's torso and was approaching his chin, creating a genuine breathing challenge that would have terrified most children. But Tommy had spent countless hours learning to control his breathing in much worse conditions. He had practiced combat techniques while partially buried in training exercises designed to simulate tunnel collapses. He had fought hand-to-hand battles in spaces barely wider than his shoulders, where traditional fighting stances were impossible and victory depended on improvisation and adaptability. Bradley seemed to be reaching the climax of his power trip, savoring the complete domination he appeared to have achieved over his victim. "This is what happens when freaks don't know their place," he declared with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had taught an important lesson. "Maybe next time you'll remember to show proper respect to your betters." The word respect triggered something deep in Tommy's psyche. He had earned respect through blood and sacrifice in tunnels where cowards died screaming and heroes were forgotten by history. He had crawled through death traps that would have broken stronger men, had faced enemies in conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. The idea that these pampered children thought they could command his respect through sandbox theatrics would have been laughable if it weren't so deeply offensive to everything he had survived. Tommy's transformation began with his eyes. The fearful, pleading expression that had been there moments before vanished completely, replaced by something cold and predatory that none of the children had ever seen before. His body language shifted, subtly but dramatically, changing from the posture of a victim to the controlled readiness of a predator assessing its prey. Kevin was the first to notice something had changed. He felt the muscles in Tommy's arms tense beneath his grip, felt a shift in the body language that triggered primitive alarm bells in his nervous system. "Guys," he said nervously, "maybe we should stop now. I think we've made our point." But Bradley was too intoxicated by his sense of power to pay attention to his friend's concerns. He continued piling sand around Tommy's neck, pushing the burial to dangerous levels while basking in what he believed was total victory over his victim. "We'll stop when I say we stop," he declared. "And I say we're just getting started with this little freak." That was when Tommy moved. The motion was so sudden and controlled that it seemed to violate the laws of physics. One moment he was buried and helpless. The next he was sitting upright, with sand cascading off his body like water. Kevin found himself lifted and thrown backward, with such force that he crashed into the wooden border of the sandbox, his head striking the edge with a sharp crack that echoed across the playground. Derek, who had been sitting on Tommy's legs, suddenly found those legs had vanished from beneath him. Before he could process what was happening, a small but incredibly strong hand grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him forward with irresistible force. His face was pressed into the sand where Tommy's head had been moments before, and he felt a knee pressed against his back with surgical precision that made breathing immediately difficult. Bradley had barely begun to register that their victim had somehow escaped burial when he felt himself being grabbed and spun around with professional efficiency. He found himself face to face with Tommy, but this wasn't the same frightened child they had been tormenting. This was something else entirely, something that radiated controlled violence and deadly competence in a way that made Bradley's primitive brain scream warnings about apex predators. Tommy's voice, when he spoke, was calm and conversational, but it carried undertones that made the children's blood run cold. "Breathing is a privilege, not a right," he said quietly, maintaining his grip on Bradley's shirt. "In the tunnels, we learned that people who waste oxygen don't deserve to keep using it." The words made no sense in the context of elementary school playground politics, but the tone and delivery communicated threat more effectively than any schoolyard posturing could have achieved. This wasn't a child making empty boasts about what he was going to do. This was someone calmly explaining reality to people who had been operating under dangerous illusions. Derek was trying to lift his head from the sand, but Tommy's knee remained pressed against his back with exactly the right amount of pressure to make the effort futile without causing permanent damage. His tunnel rat training had included extensive instruction in non-lethal restraint techniques, methods for subduing opponents without killing them when capture was preferable to elimination. The pressure points and leverage he was using had been developed by people who understood human anatomy in ways that most doctors never would. Kevin was conscious but dazed, sitting against the sandbox border with a trickle of blood running from his scalp where he had struck the wooden edge. His eyes were wide with shock and confusion, unable to process how their helpless victim had become their undisputed master in the span of seconds. The speed and efficiency of Tommy's response had been beyond anything in his experience, more like watching a nature documentary about predators than participating in playground bullying. Bradley was discovering that struggling against Tommy's grip only made the situation worse. The small hands holding his shirt seemed to be anchored to something immovable, and any attempt to break free only resulted in his clothing being twisted in ways that restricted his breathing. "Let go of me," he gasped, but the demand came out as more of a plea than a command. Tommy's expression remained perfectly calm as he studied Bradley's face with clinical interest. "You wanted to teach me about being buried," he said conversationally, "but you don't understand what burial really means. You don't understand what it feels like to have tons of earth pressing down on your chest while you're trying to fight for your life against people who want to kill you." The words were spoken matter-of-factly, but they contained implications that the children couldn't begin to process. Bradley found himself looking into eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness, eyes that belonged to someone who had survived experiences that existed far outside the realm of normal human existence. "You wanted to show me my place," Tommy continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "But you made a mistake. You assumed that quiet meant weak. You assumed that different meant defenseless. You assumed that because I chose not to fight back, it meant I couldn't fight back." The demonstration was far from over, and these children were about to learn lessons about power, violence, and consequences that would reshape their understanding of the world forever. Derek's face was pressed into the sand, experiencing firsthand what their victim had endured moments before, but with a crucial difference. Tommy's control was absolute and professional, applying exactly enough pressure to demonstrate dominance, without causing permanent harm. The precision spoke to years of training in environments where the difference between restraint and elimination was measured in pounds of pressure and degrees of angle. "The first thing they teach you about underground warfare," Tommy said, his voice maintaining that eerily calm tone, "is that panic kills more soldiers than enemy bullets. When you're trapped in a space barely wider than your body, with tons of earth above you and hostiles trying to flush you out, panic will get you buried alive." Bradley's eyes were darting frantically between his immobilized friends and Tommy's unnaturally composed face. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that his mind struggled to process what was happening. This couldn't be the same cowering child they had been tormenting for months. This had to be some kind of nightmare or hallucination brought on by too much excitement. Tommy shifted his weight slightly, and Derek immediately felt the change in pressure against his back. The movement was subtle but conveyed an unmistakable message about who controlled the situation. The second thing they teach you, Tommy continued, is that underestimating your enemy based on appearances is a fatal mistake. Size doesn't matter when you know where to apply pressure. Age doesn't matter when you understand leverage and anatomy. Kevin was still sitting against the sandbox border, blood trickling from his scalp, watching the scene unfold with the detached fascination of someone in shock. His understanding of how the world worked had been shattered in the space of 30 seconds. Children didn't move like that. Children didn't speak with that kind of authority. Children didn't possess the kind of controlled violence that Tommy was demonstrating. The playground around them had taken on an surreal quality. The distant sounds of other children playing seemed to come from another universe entirely. The autumn sun continued to shine down on what appeared to be an ordinary scene of kids playing in a sandbox, but the reality was something far more complex and dangerous than any casual observer could possibly comprehend. Tommy released his grip on Bradley's shirt, but the larger boy made no attempt to escape or retaliate. Instead, he remained frozen in place, his primitive survival instincts warning him that any sudden movement might trigger a response he couldn't handle. Tommy stepped back slightly, giving himself optimal positioning to respond to threats from multiple directions while maintaining control over all three of his former tormentors. "You want to know where I came from?" Tommy asked, addressing Bradley's earlier curiosity about his background. "You want to know why there are no school records, why I don't fit in with other kids, why I prefer to stay quiet and avoid attention?" His voice carried a weight that made the children unconsciously lean forward, compelled to hear answers to questions they were no longer sure they wanted to ask. "I came from places where children carry rifles instead of backpacks, where playgrounds are minefields and hide and seek is a matter of life and death, where the quiet ones survive because they've learned that making noise draws attention from people who kill for entertainment." The words painted pictures that the children's sheltered minds couldn't fully process, glimpses of a world that existed far beyond their comfortable suburban experience. Derek was finally allowed to lift his head from the sand, gasping and spitting grit while trying to regain his composure. The humiliation of being overpowered so easily by someone half his size was almost as traumatic as the physical restraint had been. His worldview, which had been built around the assumption that bigger and stronger always won, was crumbling with each passing moment. Tommy began moving around the sandbox with fluid grace, never quite turning his back on any of the three boys, while demonstrating a level of situational awareness that seemed almost supernatural. "You wanted to teach me about being powerless," he said, his movement pattern keeping all three children within his optimal response range. "But you don't understand what real powerlessness looks like. Real powerlessness is being 12 years old with a rifle in your hands, knowing that hesitation means death for you and everyone depending on you." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. 12 years old with a rifle. The implications were staggering and horrible, painting a picture of childhood stolen and innocence destroyed that made their own complaints about homework and chores seem pathetically trivial. Bradley found himself looking at Tommy with new eyes, trying to reconcile the small figure before him with the images of child soldiers he'd seen in documentaries his parents thought he was too young to watch. The tunnel systems in Sikji were designed by engineers who understood that warfare isn't always about who has the biggest weapons. Tommy continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting lessons learned through blood and sacrifice. "Sometimes it's about who can function effectively in conditions that break other people's minds. Sometimes it's about who can maintain tactical awareness when their environment is designed to induce claustrophobia and panic." Kevin struggled to his feet, using the sandbox border for support while his head continued to throb from the impact. The blood on his face had dried into dark streaks that made him look like a casualty from an actual battle rather than a playground altercation. "What are you?" he whispered, the question emerging before he could stop himself. Tommy's attention focused on Kevin with laser intensity, and the wounded boy immediately regretted drawing that level of scrutiny. "I'm what happens when childhood ends too early and survival becomes the only education that matters," Tommy replied. "I'm what you get when someone learns to kill before they learn to drive, when tactical assessment becomes as natural as breathing." The words hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating the innocent playground atmosphere with truths too harsh for children to fully comprehend. These boys had entered the sandbox expecting to demonstrate their dominance over a helpless victim. Instead, they had awakened something that existed far outside their understanding of normal human experience. Derek had managed to clear most of the sand from his mouth and was staring at Tommy with a mixture of fear and fascination. "You're lying," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. "Kids don't go to war. Kids don't kill people. You're just making stuff up to scare us." Tommy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture that made all three boys take involuntary steps backward. "Do you want a demonstration?" he asked conversationally. "Would you like me to show you what kids learn to do when their choice is between killing and dying?" The offer was made in the same tone someone might use to suggest a game of tag or a trip to the ice cream truck, but the underlying implications made the children's blood run cold. They were beginning to understand that they had stumbled into territory far beyond typical playground politics, that they had engaged with someone who operated according to rules they couldn't even imagine. Bradley's voice cracked when he finally found the courage to speak. "We didn't know," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperate explanation. "We thought you were just a weird kid. We were just having fun. We weren't trying to hurt you, not really hurt you. Just mess around." Tommy's laugh was soft but contained no humor whatsoever. "Just having fun," he repeated, testing the phrase like he was examining a foreign language. "You buried me in sand and called it fun. You held me down and restricted my breathing and called it fun. You triggered responses that cost me 2 years of therapy and called it fun." The mention of therapy added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. These children existed in a world where the worst trauma most of them had experienced was a bad report card or a broken toy. The idea that their harmless prank had triggered genuine psychological damage in someone who clearly carried invisible wounds was beyond their capacity to process. Kevin wiped blood from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving fresh streaks across his pale skin. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What can we do to make this right?" Tommy stopped moving and fixed Kevin with a stare that seemed to penetrate straight through to his soul. "You can learn," he said simply. "You can understand that your actions have consequences that extend far beyond your intention. You can recognize that the world contains people who have survived things that would destroy your sanity, and that those people deserve respect, not harassment." The lesson was being delivered with the patient precision of someone who had learned to communicate essential information under extreme pressure. Tommy wasn't just addressing their immediate behavior. He was attempting to impart wisdom that could prevent them from making similar mistakes with other vulnerable targets in the future. Derek was shaking now. Whether from fear or the aftermath of adrenaline, it was impossible to tell. "Are you going to hurt us?" he asked, the question emerging as a barely audible whimper. "Are you going to kill us?" Tommy's expression softened slightly, showing the first glimpse of something that resembled the child he appeared to be. "No," he said, and the relief in the three boys was almost palpable. "Killing is for enemies who threaten innocent people. You're not enemies. You're just children who made a very serious mistake because no one ever taught you to recognize when you were crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed." The distinction was important and spoke to a moral framework that had been forged in circumstances where life and death decisions were made on a daily basis. Tommy had learned to categorize threats and respond proportionally, to distinguish between genuine enemies and misguided adversaries who could be educated rather than eliminated. Bradley found his voice again, though it emerged as a croak. "What happens now? What do we do now?" Tommy resumed his movement around the sandbox, but his posture was less predatory now, more instructive than threatening. "Now you learn to live with the knowledge of what you've done and who you've done it to. You learn that the quiet kid in the corner might be quiet for reasons you can't imagine. You learn that different doesn't mean defective and that not fighting back doesn't mean unable to fight back." The transformation in the three boys was visible and dramatic. The confident bullies who had entered the sandbox were gone, replaced by chastened children who had been given a glimpse of a world they never wanted to see again. Their understanding of power dynamics, of victim and victimizer, of strength and weakness, had been fundamentally altered in ways that would influence their behavior for years to come. Kevin slumped against the sandbox border, exhaustion and shock finally catching up with him. "We'll leave you alone," he promised. "We won't bother you anymore. We won't tell anyone what happened here." Tommy nodded acknowledgement but continued his lesson. "It's not just about leaving me alone. It's about understanding that everyone you meet might be carrying invisible wounds that you can't see. The shy girl in your math class might have reasons for being shy that have nothing to do with weakness. The quiet boy who eats lunch alone might be alone because he's learned that solitude is safer than exposure." The words carried implications that extended far beyond their specific situation, suggesting a worldview shaped by experiences that had taught fundamental lessons about human nature and survival. Tommy was attempting to impart wisdom that could make them better people, not just different people. Derek wiped sand from his face with trembling hands. "How do we know?" he asked. "How do we know when someone is like you? How do we know when we're crossing those lines?" The question showed a level of introspection that hadn't been present in any of his previous behavior, suggesting that the lesson was beginning to take root in ways that might produce lasting change. Tommy paused his movement to consider the question seriously, recognizing it as a genuine attempt to understand rather than a deflection or excuse. "You assume that everyone has survived something you can't imagine," Tommy replied. "You treat every person you meet as if they might be carrying invisible wounds that could be reopened by careless actions. You understand that your power to hurt someone is not permission to use that power." The moral framework he was describing represented years of hard-earned wisdom, lessons learned in environments where empathy and restraint were often the difference between civilization and barbarity. He was attempting to give these children tools they could use to navigate the world without inflicting unnecessary damage on others or themselves. Bradley struggled to his feet, sand cascading from his expensive clothes, as he tried to process everything he had learned. What if we mess up again? What if we forget and go back to the way we were before? Tommy's answer was immediate and definitive. Then you'll discover that some lessons are only taught once, and some teachers don't offer second chances. The threat was delivered quietly, but with absolute conviction, making it clear that his restraint today should not be mistaken for an ongoing policy of nonviolence. The playground around them was beginning to show signs of activity as recess time drew to a close. Other children were gathering their belongings and preparing to return to classrooms, creating a sense of urgency about resolving the situation before it could be observed and reported by adults who wouldn't understand the context. Tommy began, moving toward the edge of the sandbox, his demonstration apparently complete. "Remember what you've learned here," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "Remember that the world contains people who have survived hell and emerged stronger, not weaker. Remember that your ignorance of someone's history doesn't protect you from the consequences of triggering their responses. Kevin pushed himself away from the sandbox border, his head still throbbing, but his understanding fundamentally changed. "We'll remember," he promised, and the sincerity in his voice suggested that the lesson had indeed taken root in ways that would influence his future behavior. Derek and Bradley nodded their agreement, though they remained too shaken to speak. The confident bullies who had entered the sandbox no longer existed, replaced by children who had been given a terrifying glimpse of what real violence looked like when it was controlled by someone who truly understood its application. Tommy retrieved his book from where it had fallen near the sandbox, brushing sand from its worn cover with the reverence of someone handling a sacred object. The casual dismissal of his most precious possession had been the catalyst for this entire confrontation, but now the book was being treated with the respect it deserved by everyone present. As the bell rang signaling the end of recess, Tommy looked back at the three boys one final time. "Childhood is supposed to be innocent," he said quietly. "Some of us never got to experience that innocence, but that doesn't mean we have to destroy it for others. Learn to protect innocence instead of exploiting it." The words carried the weight of someone who had lost his own childhood to circumstances beyond his control, but had chosen to use that loss as motivation to protect others rather than to inflict similar damage. It was a final lesson in choosing strength over bitterness, wisdom over revenge. Tommy walked away from the sandbox with the same quiet dignity he had always possessed. But something fundamental had changed. The other children on the playground watched him pass with a new awareness, sensing that something significant had occurred, even if they didn't understand the details. Word would spread quickly through the school's social networks, though. True story would be known only to those who had experienced it firsthand. Bradley, Derek, and Kevin remained by the sandbox long after Tommy had disappeared into the school building, each struggling to process what they had witnessed and learned. Their understanding of power, violence, strength, and weakness had been fundamentally altered in ways that would influence their behavior for the rest of their lives. The quiet kid had taught them that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who appear the most harmless, that survival skills can be hidden behind innocent facades, and that true strength often chooses restraint over violence. Most importantly, they had learned that actions have consequences that extend far beyond intention, and that those consequences can be swift, decisive, and utterly transformative. In the days and weeks that followed, the three former bullies would find themselves changed in ways they couldn't fully articulate. They became protectors of other vulnerable students rather than predators. They learned to recognize signs of hidden trauma and to respond with compassion rather than exploitation. They discovered that true power came from lifting others up rather than pushing them down. Tommy continued his quiet existence at Jefferson Elementary, but he was no longer invisible. Other students treated him with a respect that bordered on reverence, sensing that he carried knowledge and experience that set him apart from ordinary children. Teachers noticed the change in classroom dynamics without understanding its source, pleased to see a reduction in bullying behavior that seemed to spread organically through the student body. The sandbox incident became the stuff of playground legend, though the details varied wildly depending on who told the story. Some versions portrayed Tommy as a martial arts master who could defeat grown men. Others suggested he had special forces training or supernatural abilities. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any of the rumors, but Tommy never corrected the misconceptions or sought to clarify the record. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. He had crawled through death traps that would have broken stronger men, had faced enemies in conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. The idea that these pampered children thought they could command his respect through sandbox theatrics would have been laughable if it weren't so deeply offensive to everything he had survived. Tommy's transformation began with his eyes. The fearful, pleading expression that had been there moments before vanished completely, replaced by something cold and predatory that none of the children had ever seen before. His body language shifted, subtly but dramatically, changing from the posture of a victim to the controlled readiness of a predator assessing its prey. Kevin was the first to notice something had changed. He felt the muscles in Tommy's arms tense beneath his grip, felt a shift in the body language that triggered primitive alarm bells in his nervous system. "Guys," he said nervously, "maybe we should stop now. I think we've made our point." But Bradley was too intoxicated by his sense of power to pay attention to his friend's concerns. He continued piling sand around Tommy's neck, pushing the burial to dangerous levels while basking in what he believed was total victory over his victim. "We'll stop when I say we stop," he declared. "And I say we're just getting started with this little freak." That was when Tommy moved. The motion was so sudden and controlled that it seemed to violate the laws of physics. One moment he was buried and helpless, the next he was sitting upright with sand cascading off his body like water. Kevin found himself lifted and thrown backward, with such force that he crashed into the wooden border of the sandbox, his head striking the edge with a sharp crack that echoed across the playground. Derek, who had been sitting on Tommy's legs, suddenly found those legs had vanished from beneath him. Before he could process what was happening, a small but incredibly strong hand grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him forward with irresistible force. His face was pressed into the sand where Tommy's head had been moments before, and he felt a knee pressed against his back with surgical precision that made breathing immediately difficult. Bradley had barely begun to register that their victim had somehow escaped burial when he felt himself being grabbed and spun around with professional efficiency. He found himself face to face with Tommy, but this wasn't the same frightened child they had been tormenting. This was something else entirely, something that radiated controlled violence and deadly competence in a way that made Bradley's primitive brain scream warnings about apex predators. Tommy's voice, when he spoke, was calm and conversational, but it carried undertones that made the children's blood run cold. "Breathing is a privilege, not a right," he said quietly, maintaining his grip on Bradley's shirt. "In the tunnels, we learned that people who waste oxygen don't deserve to keep using it." The words made no sense in the context of elementary school playground politics, but the tone and delivery communicated threat more effectively than any schoolyard posturing could have achieved. This wasn't a child making empty boasts about what he was going to do. This was someone calmly explaining reality to people who had been operating under dangerous illusions. Derek was trying to lift his head from the sand, but Tommy's knee remained pressed against his back with exactly the right amount of pressure to make the effort futile without causing permanent damage. His tunnel rat training had included extensive instruction in non-lethal restraint techniques, methods for subduing opponents without killing them when capture was preferable to elimination. The pressure points and leverage he was using had been developed by people who understood human anatomy in ways that most doctors never would. Kevin was conscious but dazed, sitting against the sandbox border with a trickle of blood running from his scalp where he had struck the wooden edge. His eyes were wide with shock and confusion, unable to process how their helpless victim had become their undisputed master in the span of seconds. The speed and efficiency of Tommy's response had been beyond anything in his experience, more like watching a nature documentary about predators than participating in playground bullying. Bradley was discovering that struggling against Tommy's grip only made the situation worse. The small hands holding his shirt seemed to be anchored to something immovable, and any attempt to break free only resulted in his clothing being twisted in ways that restricted his breathing. "Let go of me," he gasped, but the demand came out as more of a plea than a command. Tommy's expression remained perfectly calm as he studied Bradley's face with clinical interest. "You wanted to teach me about being buried," he said conversationally. "But you don't understand what burial really means." You don't understand what it feels like to have tons of earth pressing down on your chest while you're trying to fight for your life against people who want to kill you." The words were spoken matter-of-factly, but they contained implications that the children couldn't begin to process. Bradley found himself looking into eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness. Eyes that belonged to someone who had survived experiences that existed far outside the realm of normal human existence. "You wanted to show me my place," Tommy continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "But you made a mistake. You assumed that quiet meant weak. You assumed that different meant defenseless. You assumed that because I chose not to fight back, it meant I couldn't fight back." The demonstration was far from over, and these children were about to learn lessons about power, violence, and consequences that would reshape their understanding of the world forever. Derek's face was pressed into the sand, experiencing firsthand what their victim had endured moments before, but with a crucial difference. Tommy's control was absolute and professional, applying exactly enough pressure to demonstrate dominance without causing permanent harm. The precision spoke to years of training in environments where the difference between restraint and elimination was measured in pounds of pressure and degrees of angle. "The first thing they teach you about underground warfare," Tommy said, his voice maintaining that eerily calm tone, "is that panic kills more soldiers than enemy bullets. When you're trapped in a space barely wider than your body, with tons of earth above you and hostiles trying to flush you out, panic will get you buried alive." Bradley's eyes were darting frantically between his immobilized friends and Tommy's unnaturally composed face. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that his mind struggled to process what was happening. This couldn't be the same cowering child they had been tormenting for months. This had to be some kind of nightmare or hallucination brought on by too much excitement. Tommy shifted his weight slightly, and Derek immediately felt the change in pressure against his back.